Hey everyone! Tonight, we're stepping into the Cretaceous, a world where birds were already ancient while Tyrannosaurus still ruled. Before we go further, hit like and subscribe if you love mind-blowing natural history. Drop a comment with where you are listening from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights. The popular story is simple. The asteroid killed the dinosaurs, then birds evolved. But that's completely backward. Birds lived alongside dinosaurs for 80 million years. How did they manage that? And why were they the only lineage to survive the apocalypse? Let's find out. For over a century, museum displays and textbooks have told us that dinosaurs died, and then birds filled the skies. But the fossil record tells a far more astonishing story. Birds are not the replacements of dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs. More precisely, they are the only living branch of the theropod family tree, the same group of hollow-boned predators that included the velociraptors and the mighty Tyrannosaurus rex. The first birds emerged, not after the extinction, but a staggering 100 million years before it. Their classic lightweight body plan, feathers, wings, and wishbones, was pieced together gradually across tens of millions of years in the Jurassic. By the time the asteroid struck 66 million years ago, birds had already been flying, swimming, and filling forests for longer than humans have existed. They were not a last-minute afterthought of the dinosaur era. They were an ancient and thriving parallel lineage, watching the giants fade. Now, this challenges everything we think we know about survival. If birds were already here while T. rex was alive, why did they make it through the global cataclysm that wiped out every single other dinosaur? What secret advantage did they possess, hidden in their small bodies and rapid metabolisms, that allowed them to endure fire, darkness, and starvation? The answer shatters the myth of passive survivors. Birds were not the lucky beneficiaries of an empty world. They were an evolutionary experiment so wildly successful that not even the end of the Cretaceous could stop it. Tonight, we're going back to the forests of the Jurassic and the coastlines of the Cretaceous to trace the incredible, invisible rise of the avian lineage, a story of supercharged evolution, ecological cunning, and a resilience that would forever change the Earth. Because before the asteroid, the birds were already winning. Before the asteroid, the birds were already winning. So let's rewind, far past the familiar chaos of the late Cretaceous, past the towering Tyrannosaurus and the armored Ankylosaurus. We're going back 165 million years into the Jurassic, a world where the largest dinosaurs had just begun asserting dominance, and in the fern-covered understory, a remarkable secret was taking shape. That secret was not some grand evolutionary leap, but a patient and piecemeal experiment, a skeleton slowly reshaping itself across 30 million years of incremental change. The earliest players were small, predatory theropods, feathered, agile, and completely unremarkable at first glance. Ancestors like Enchiornis, discovered in the volcanic ash of northeast China and dated to around 165 million years ago, had full plumage, 4 wings, and a body built for the trees. But here is the crucial detail. Enchiornis was not yet a bird. Its arms were too short, its center of gravity still dinosaurian. Yet, that dense coat of feathers was the first whisper of a lineage about to invent flight. This is where the timeline in textbooks gets quietly rewritten every decade as fossils emerge from the stone. The classic story places Archaeopteryx, the so-called first bird, at 150 million years ago. And yes, Archaeopteryx is astonishing, a magpie-sized creature with flight feathers asymmetrically shaped for airfoil lift, a wishbone, and a big toe that could grasp branches. But if you saw it alive, your brain would short-circuit. That snout full of tiny teeth, that long bony tail trailing behind like a miniature dragon, those 3 clawed fingers on each wing. It was a dinosaur that could fly, not a modern bird. And that's precisely the point. There was no clean line between dinosaur and bird. The bird body plan was assembled in layers, like a slow-motion sculpture by an artist with no final design. Hollow bones appeared in theropods millions of years before flight. Feathers came before wings. Wings came before the acrobatic flight muscles we know today. Each piece was a standalone adaptation serving a different purpose: warmth, display, gliding, then eventually powered flight. And the assembly was so gradual that any attempt to draw a sharp first bird boundary is almost futile. Now, here is something that will shift your perspective. According to a study led by Michael Lee and published in Science, those earliest emerging birds were evolving at a supercharged rate, significantly faster than their non-bird dinosaur relatives like Velociraptor or the four-winged glider Zhenyuanlong. While the giant theropods were refining already proven body plans for massive size, the avialan lineage was in a rapid prototyping mode, shrinking body mass, shortening the tail, expanding the brain, and fusing skeletal elements at a pace unseen in other dinosaur groups. This was not random. Once a small, flight-capable dinosaur had been assembled, incredible evolutionary potential was unlocked. These airborne pioneers now had access to three-dimensional habitats: forest canopies, cliff faces, distant islands that ground-bound dinosaurs couldn't exploit. The front door of ecological opportunity had swung wide open. But here is the thing: being a feathered flying dinosaur in the Jurassic didn't automatically guarantee a bright future. For tens of millions of years after Archaeopteryx, birds remained rare actors on the Mesozoic stage. The fossil record is stingy with early avialans, partly because their delicate hollow bones rarely fossilized, and partly because they were likely living in upland forests away from the swampy lowlands that favor preservation. Yet the Cretaceous period, beginning 145 million years ago, would change that dramatically. The next chapter was explosive. It would see birds diversify into a staggering array of forms that shared the world with all your favorite dinosaur celebrities. Let's walk into the early Cretaceous, about 125 million years ago, in what is now northeastern China's Liaoning province. Volcanic eruptions periodically buried entire ecosystems in fine ash, capturing life at moments of terrible catastrophe. The Jehol biota, as paleontologists call it, is a miracle of preservation. And flitting among the lakeside conifers and ginkgo trees, you would spot birds that look wildly different from Archaeopteryx. Confuciusornis, for instance, a crow-sized bird with a toothless beak, the first known beak in the fossil record, and a pair of long ornamental tail feathers that males likely flaunted. Thousands of Confuciusornis fossils have been recovered, some in mass death assemblages around ancient lake beds, hinting at gregarious behavior and a diet of seeds. This was a fully volant bird, with a sophisticated flight apparatus and a beak adapted for processing hard foods, living alongside feathered dinosaurs like Sinosauropteryx and the four-winged Microraptor. The diversification was well underway. But Confuciusornis and its kin were still not on the direct line to modern birds. That branch belonged to the Enantiornithines, a name meaning opposite birds, referring to the reversed articulation of their shoulder bones compared to today's birds. By the late Cretaceous, Enantiornithines were everywhere. They were the default avian. Picture a world where toothed birds with clawed wings nested in colonies along rivers, catching insects on the wing, daintily picking through canopy foliage, and perching alongside pterosaurs. Fossil embryos preserved inside their eggs show that enantiornithine chicks were precocial, able to move, and perhaps feed themselves soon after hatching, unlike the naked helpless hatchlings of most modern birds. Yet despite their dominance and diversity, every single enantiornithine would perish. None of them made it across the boundary. While the enantiornithines ruled, the lineage that would spawn ducks, chickens, ostriches, and every songbird you've ever seen was quietly experimenting with a different strategy. They were the ornithorines, the birds. In the late Cretaceous, they produced bizarre and breathtaking forms. Hesperornis, a flightless diving bird up to 6 feet long, propelled itself through shallow seas with powerful lobed feet, while its teeth, set in a long beak, seized fish with surgical precision. Imagine a toothed loon that lived alongside plesiosaurs. Its distant cousin, Ichthyornis, looked more like a modern gull, a tern-like flyer with sharp teeth and a well-developed keel on its breastbone, an anchor for powerful flight muscles. Both genera already show the respiratory system we associate with modern high-altitude migrators, unidirectional airflow through the lungs and air sacs that hollowed out their bones, giving them the oxygen efficiency to support burst flight and deep diving. That system was a Jurassic inheritance refined in the Cretaceous, and it would later prove a life insurance policy beyond imagination. And now we reach a fact that should completely dismantle the old narrative. By 80 million years ago, well before the asteroid, the fossil record shows that stem members of modern bird orders were already present. The fragmentary fossils from the late Cretaceous of Antarctica, Canada, and Madagascar suggest that early waterfowl, early galliforms, and even early shorebirds were pecking around the edges of the Cretaceous world. Analysis of the genetic clocks and fossil calibrations indicates that the divergence of neo-avs, the vast group containing parrots, hummingbirds, crows, and sparrows, began deep within the Cretaceous. Every time a chickadee visits your feeder, you are seeing a lineage that was already establishing itself while Triceratops grazed and Tyrannosaurus rex ambushed hadrosaurs. The ducks in your local park descend from ancestors that honked in the shadow of the king tyrant reptile. That's not a poetic exaggeration, that's the literal timing. But how do we know this? The evidence comes from painstaking comparative anatomy, cladistic analyses, and the slow accumulation of Cretaceous crown bird fossils that fit within modern family trees. For years, paleontologists debated the timing, but recent finds like the Antarctic Vegavis, a 67-million-year-old fossil that appears to be a genuine Anseriform, a duck relative, firmly push modern bird diversification into the Mesozoic. This means that while the non-avian dinosaurs were entering their final act, modern bird lineages were not a distant hope. They were already a thriving global presence. They were small, yes, often mouse-sized or robin-sized, because the niches for large terrestrial animals were fully occupied by their dinosaurian cousins, but they had already filled the air, the forests, the shorelines, and the polar summers. Now, here's the first twist that sends a chill through the narrative. If birds were so successful, so widespread, having lived through 100 million years of dinosaur coexistence, why were they nearly annihilated at the same moment as their giant cousins? The meteor that struck the Yucatan 66 million years ago did not distinguish between a toothed enantiornithine and a toothless ornithorine. It incinerated forests, triggered acid rain, and blotted out the sun for years, collapsing global food webs that began with photosynthetic plankton in the oceans and plants on land. Creatures that depended on leaves, fruits, and insects, the exact diet of many Cretaceous birds, starved or froze. It wasn't enough to be airborne. It wasn't enough to have feathers. Survival would require something else, a hidden advantage that even the most advanced enantiornithines lacked. The central tension that will drive the rest of our journey is this: 4 distinct bird lineages passed through the KPG boundary. 4. Out of all the avian diversity that had accumulated across the Cretaceous, including dozens of enantiornithine families, only the ancestors of ostriches, ducks, chickens, and the enormous Neo-Aves radiation survived. This is a catastrophic bottleneck, not a gentle transition. The survival was not random luck scattered across the bird family tree. It was concentrated in a particular group, the ornithorines, and even among them, only those with specific traits. The enantiornithines, the most abundant and diverse Mesozoic birds, were wiped out completely. Their toothed beaks, clawed wings, and precocial chicks that had served them so well for 80 million years suddenly became liabilities. The question is why. And here we encounter the true puzzle. It wasn't just about beak shape or flight speed. The survivors shared an ecological profile. They were small-bodied, mainly ground foraging or aquatic, and likely ate seeds and detritus during the impact winter. But that's not the full picture. Behavioral flexibility and developmental strategy may have been the invisible key. Imagine the impact winter as a brutal filter. The skies go dark, vegetation dies back, and the insect swarms collapse. A bird that hatches early and requires immediate parental feeding for weeks is at a severe disadvantage. Enantiornithine chicks, despite being precocial in some respects, may still have relied on specific insects or soft plant matter that disappeared. Modern bird chicks are altricial, helpless, naked, dependent, but that dependency requires parents that can find food, even in a barren landscape. Perhaps the surviving lineages possessed a combination of altriciality and flexible parental feeding that allowed them to bridge the gap better. Or perhaps it was their toothless beaks, lighter and more versatile, that allowed them to process tough seeds when soft insects vanished. The debate among paleontologists is fierce, and the fossils are still whispering. But before we get to the impact night, before the fire and the darkness, we need to fully appreciate the world that birds had built. It wasn't a quiet prelude. It was a cacophony of avian experiments, a world where a 6-foot diving bird could swim under a mosasaur, where a duck ancestor would roost in the ferns while a T-Rex crashed through the undergrowth, where a parrot-like bird cracked nuts in the canopy above a herd of hadrosaurs. That world was real, and it lasted far longer than the time separating us from the last dinosaur. The birds were not waiting patiently in the wings for their cue. They were starring in their own drama, and the fall of the curtain would be sudden and absolute. So now we stand at the precipice, 66 million years ago. The stage is set. Birds have achieved a biological miracle: flight, endothermy, complex song, and deep roots in every continent. They have already survived climate shifts, volcanic winters, and 100 million years of ecological upheaval. But the greatest test is barreling toward Earth at 20 kilometers per second, and it will force a reckoning that separates the survivors from the ghosts. When the sky catches fire and the global forests collapse, why will some feathered dinosaurs endure, while every other dinosaur footprint stops forever? The answer lies not in the immediate aftermath, but in the deep secret that had been building inside the avian lineage since Jurassic origins. And that secret, the true reason birds are still here, is not just in their bones, but in their very way of life. But first, the night the sun vanished. The impact that ended the Cretaceous didn't begin with a roar. It began with a flash brighter than 1,000 suns, and then silence as the shockwave took its time crossing the Gulf of Mexico. The asteroid, a chunk of carbonaceous chondrite roughly 10 kilometers wide, slammed into the shallow sea that covered what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. In the first microsecond of contact, the rock released more energy than 1 billion Hiroshima bombs. The seafloor vaporized. The asteroid itself disintegrated. A plume of superheated rock, dust, and sulfur-rich gypsum mushroomed into the stratosphere, while a wall of seismic energy raced through the planet's crust, triggering massive earthquakes and volcanic belches on the opposite side of the globe. Within minutes, ejecta from the Chicxulub crater began to fall back through the atmosphere as a global rain of molten glass spherules, setting fire to forests everywhere. The entire planet became a broiler. Now, picture what that meant for any creature alive on the surface. In North America, a continent close to ground zero, the thermal pulse from the returning ejecta was enough to ignite vegetation like dry kindling. Animals caught in the open were seared alive. Even those that found a burrow or a cave had to endure an oven-like atmosphere for hours, then days of suffocating dust and smoke. The fossil record captures this moment in places like the Hell Creek Formation in Montana, where the boundary clay is a stark, iridium-rich stripe of extraterrestrial origin, and below it lie Triceratops, Tyrannosaurus rex, and a whole thriving ecosystem. Above that stripe, Almost nothing. A silenced world. But birds were in that world, and we can now reconstruct their ordeal with painful clarity. Let's travel to the Cretaceous coastal forests that fringed the western interior seaway a few hours before the impact. Enantiornithine birds, the toothed flyers, are abundant. They are nesting in the branches of araucarias and ginkgos, their chicks peeping from ball-like nests of mud and twigs. On the shoreline, Hesperornis propels itself among the waves, chasing fish. Further inland, small ornithorines, duck-like vegavis relatives and quail-like ground birds, scratch through the leaf litter for seeds and insects. A world alive with birdsong and the groaning of distant hadrosaurs. And then the sky starts to glow a strange, sickly orange. The first thing that hits is the seismic wave, a ripple in the earth so violent that trees sway like grass. Birds burst from the canopy in panic. Then comes the thermal radiation, a heat that grows in seconds to a lethal blanket. Those enantiornithines in the trees are directly exposed. The feathers that insulated and enabled flight now combust. Those that fling themselves into the air are overtaken by the superheated blast wave, their hollow bones pulverized. The water birds dive, but the sea itself begins to churn with tsunamis racing outward from the crater. For hours, the planet convulses, and the avian world is shattered. But this was only the opening salvo. The real executioner was the darkness that followed. Ejecta and soot from the global fires clouded the upper atmosphere, reducing sunlight by up to 90% for years. Temperatures plummeted by more than 20 degrees Celsius in a matter of months, plunging Earth into an impact winter that lasted perhaps a decade. Photosynthesis collapsed. Phytoplankton in the oceans, the base of the marine food web, died off catastrophically, and with them went the fish, the marine reptiles, the ammonites. On land, plants that required strong sunlight withered. Forests that had stood for millions of years became dead, leafless poles. The herbivorous dinosaurs, dependent on fresh vegetation, starved on a continental scale. Their carnivorous cousins, the tyrannosaurs and dromaeosaurs, followed them into oblivion, the absence of prey starving them in turn. The asteroid had triggered a cascading unraveling of the food web that no large animal could survive. But somewhere in this hellscape, a few feathered dinosaurs clung to life. The question that has vexed paleontologists for decades is simple. Why these few? Why did every enantiornithine lineage, representing perhaps 90% of Cretaceous bird diversity, vanish without a trace, while 4 unassuming ornithorine branches made it to the other side? The answer is hidden in the details of what they ate, where they lived, and how they grew. Let's examine the arboreal problem first. Enantiornithines were mostly tree dwellers. Their clawed wings and reversed shoulder joints were adaptations for climbing and perching in a 3-dimensional canopy world. They had toothed beaks suited for snatching insects, soft fruits, and perhaps small vertebrates. When the forests died, their entire habitat went extinct. Trees don't just take a few months to leaf out again. They require seed banks, pollinators, and intact soil. The impact, winter, destroyed the forest ecosystem so thoroughly that it took thousands of years for complex forests to return. An arboreal bird with a specialized diet had no fallback. It couldn't scratch in the dirt for buried seeds. Its beak structure wasn't designed for that. It couldn't suddenly adapt to an aquatic life. Its body plan was all wrong. The enantiornithines had dominated for 80 million years, by perfecting a niche that vanished overnight. That's a brutal but precise definition of evolutionary dead end. To be exquisitely adapted to a world that ceases to exist. Now, the surviving lineages, the ancestors of ostriches, ducks, chickens, and neo-avians, shared a very different profile. They were predominantly ground dwellers or capable swimmers, tied to aquatic or open habitats that, while devastated, still offered some refuge. The small body size of these survivors, many no larger than a modern quail, was a superpower. A body mass under 1 kilogram meant an individual could sustain itself on far fewer calories. When the skies went dark and plants died, the food chain didn't disappear entirely. It reorganized around detritus, seeds, spores, and the organisms that fed on decaying matter. A tiny beak that could crack open a tough, dormant seed, a package of energy that had sat in the soil waiting for better times, was now the most valuable tool in the world. This is where the toothless beak becomes a potential savior in its own right. Some research, notably by paleontologist Daniel Field and colleagues, suggests that the loss of teeth in the ornithurine lineage may have been a key pre-adaptation for surviving the impact. Teeth are heavy, they require growing, and they limit beak shape versatility. A toothless beak, keratinous and lightweight, can evolve into a seed-crushing bill, a filter-feeding bill, or a delicate insect plucker with relative ease. In the post-impact world, when insects may have been scarce and soft plant tissues gone, seeds offered a durable, widespread food source. A bird that could efficiently crack seeds had a lifeline. Vegaves, the early duck relative from Antarctica, likely had a broad bill suited for straining small particles from water and sediment. Exactly the kind of omnivorous feeding strategy that could keep an animal alive when the water column was full of decaying organic fluff rather than live fish. Beyond diet, another hidden factor was developmental biology. Modern birds are mostly altricial. Their chicks hatch naked, blind, and helpless, absolutely dependent on parental feeding. Enantiornithine chicks, based on incredible fossil embryos found inside fossilized eggs, were precocial, hatching with feathers and a degree of independence. At first glance, precociality seems like an advantage in a crisis. The chick can move and find its own food immediately. But if its specific food is gone, that independence is worthless. An altricial chick, however, can survive as long as its parents can find and deliver nutrition. A parent that could switch to seeds, detritus, or scavenged material could sustain its brood, even if the environment had changed radically. The food the parents feed the chicks doesn't have to be the ideal natural diet. It just has to keep them alive until fledging. This flexibility in provisioning might have been the decisive edge of the survivors. The great enantiornithine experiment of independent hatchlings backfired catastrophically when their niche collapsed. We also cannot ignore the reality of geography. The southern continents, particularly Antarctica, then ice-free and forested, and the southern tips of South America, Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, were farther from the impact site and may have experienced less severe immediate thermal effects. The fossil Vegaves was found in Antarctica, and many early modern bird fossils have been unearthed from the southern hemisphere. Perhaps the southern forests died more slowly, or the marine ecosystems provided a more reliable food source. Perhaps the birds that rode out the darkness in polar regions, already adapted to seasonal light extremes, had a head start. The geography of survival is still being mapped, but the pattern is suggestive. The birds that made it through were not randomly scattered. They were clustered in lineages with inherent hardiness. But let's not paint too smooth a picture. The survival of birds was not a graceful glide through catastrophe. It was a desperate fingertip hang onto existence. Genetic studies of modern birds show that all 10,000-plus species today descend from a handful of lineages that passed through a severe population bottleneck at the KPG boundary. The effective population size of the Neo-avian ancestor might have been just a few thousand individuals, possibly less. The fossil record shows the same. For every Vegaves-type duck that survived, perhaps dozens of other duck-like birds perished. The 4 lineages that made it were not necessarily the best, but the luckiest among the lucky, the ones that happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right pre-existing traits. Extinction is often a lottery of pre-adaptation plus circumstance, and the KPG event was the most dramatic lottery in Earth's history. Now, here is the pivot that reframes everything we've discussed. The popular narrative says that after the asteroid, the dinosaurs died, and then birds arose to fill their niches. But we now know that birds were already filling those niches before the impact. The enantiornithines were the dominant small-bodied flying dinosaurs. The ornithorines were the experimental offshoots. The asteroid didn't clear the way for birds. It wiped out most of the birds and left only a tiny remnant struggling on the edge of existence. The extinction was a near-death experience for the avian lineage itself. When we ask why birds survived, we're really asking why a tiny minority of birds survived. The asteroid was not a freeing event for birds. It was the greatest culling they ever endured. Let's sit with that paradox. The age of dinosaurs didn't end because birds were better and outpaced their cousins. The enantiornithines were arguably more successful than any modern bird lineage in terms of longevity and diversity at the time. They had toothed beaks, clawed wings, and colonies by the millions. They filled the niches of warblers, flycatchers, terns, and even small raptors. Yet not a single one of them survived. This means that the traits we associate with modern bird success, the toothless beak, the flexible feeding, the altricial chick, were not a pathway to inevitable triumph. They were just one set of experiments that happened to be pre-adapted to an impossible, once-in-100-million-year catastrophe. The enantiornithines lost the genetic lottery, not through any fault of their own, but because the filter was so extreme that only the most generalist, the most adaptable, the most terrestrially grounded few could slip through. This leads us to a chilling realization. The asteroid did not discriminate between old-fashioned toothed birds and modern toothless birds. It discriminated on lifestyle and location. If the impact had happened 10 million years earlier, when enantiornithines were even more dominant and ornithorines still rare, would any bird have survived? Possibly not. The survival of birds was contingent on a narrow window of evolutionary history where a handful of modern-style birds had already diversified just enough to provide the right combination of traits. Birds were not fated to survive. They scraped through by a whisker. Their entire post-Cretaceous radiation is built on that razor-thin edge of luck. Now, imagine the world that dawned after the darkness lifted. The sky was still hazy with lingering aerosols, the ground a mat of fungal decay, the forests gone, replaced by low scrub and pioneer ferns. But the surviving birds were there, a few ducks sniffing through the mud for invertebrates, some quail-like fowl pecking at fern spores, an ostrich-like runner striding through the desolation, and the ancestors of all perching birds, still small and drab, scratching in the soil. The pressure was off, not because they were now free of dinosaurs, but because the world was empty of competitors. The great avian radiation of the Paleogene was not a reward for being the best. It was the consequence of being the last ones standing. But there's a deeper question that still haunts paleontology. If the survivors were so few, so uniform in their adaptations, how did they then give rise to the most diverse vertebrate group on land? How did a handful of ground-dwelling seed-eaters and aquatic filter feeders explode into eagles, penguins, hummingbirds, and parrots in a geological heartbeat? That's the next chapter, and it demands we look inside the body plan that these survivors carried, the same hollow-boned, one-way breathing, hot-blooded engine that the theropods had been refining for 160 million years. The secret of birds was not just surviving the fire. It was what they did with the cold, empty garden that came after, and what they did would change the face of the earth more profoundly than any dinosaur ever could. And what they did would change the face of the earth more profoundly than any dinosaur ever could. When the sun finally broke through the lingering haze, the world was a biological blank slate. The forests were gone. The giant herbivores were gone. The tyrannosaurs, the ceratopsians, the hadrosaurs, all gone. In their place stood a planet of scrubby ferns, fungal mats, and meandering rivers cutting through ash-choked floodplains. It was a cold, empty garden, and the surviving birds were its first and most versatile colonists. But here is the part that's rarely appreciated. That handful of survivors didn't just limp along and eventually diversify over tens of millions of years. The fossil record, increasingly rich with Paleogene birds, tells a different story, an evolutionary explosion that was shockingly fast. Within just a few million years after the impact, the bird lineage had already begun to experiment with body plans that we would recognize today. Penguins appear in the fossil record by about 62 million years ago, just 4 million years after the worst day in Earth's history. They were already flightless, already adapted for diving in cool southern oceans. The first owls, parrots, and mousebirds show up not long after. The diversification was not a slow, stately march. It was a riot. So, what made this possible? What allowed a handful of ground-foraging seed-eaters and snail-straining waterfowl to become the most aerially, morphologically, and ecologically diverse group of vertebrates on the planet? The answer lies in a toolkit that had been assembled over 160 million years of theropod evolution, a toolkit that the non-avian dinosaurs had never lost, but had never been pressed into such an extreme reconfiguration. That toolkit was already there, waiting in the surviving birds, and it consisted of 3 key innovations that predated the asteroid by tens of millions of years: the feather, the one-way lung, and the lightweight skeleton. Let's take each in turn. Feathers are the most obvious bird feature, but their original purpose had nothing to do with flight. The earliest proto-feathers were simple filaments, perhaps used for insulation or display in small theropods. Over time, they evolved complex branching and interlocking barbules, creating the aerodynamic flight feathers that Archaeopteryx already wore. After the extinction, feathers became the medium for entirely new functions. Insulation allowed birds to invade cold high latitudes and high altitudes. Elaborate plumage, powered by sexual selection, drove the evolution of insane colors and shapes, from the peacock's train to the bird of paradise's plumes. But more critically, feathers gave birds the ability to control their body temperature with exquisite precision. Endothermy, warm-bloodedness, was a dinosaurian trait, but birds refined it to a level that mammals would struggle to match. A high, stable body temperature meant a high metabolic rate, which in turn meant fast growth, rapid healing, and the power needed for sustained flight. Then there's the lung. Birds breathe in a way that no mammal does. Their respiratory system includes a series of air sacs that extend into their bones, creating a unidirectional flow through the lungs. This extracts oxygen far more efficiently than the mammalian two-way system, allowing birds to fly at altitudes where mammals would pass out, and to sustain high-energy activities like migration. But this system is not a bird invention. It was already present in the theropod dinosaurs. We find pneumatic bones, bones with air sac cavities, in Tyrannosaurus rex, in velociraptors, in sauropods. It's an ancient archosaurian innovation that birds inherited and supercharged. After the asteroid, when oxygen levels fluctuated and the world was cooler, this respiratory efficiency gave birds a competitive edge in the newly available niches. A bird could migrate long distances over barren landscapes, exploiting seasonal resources that ground-bound animals couldn't reach. The lightweight skeleton, similarly, is a theropod hallmark. Hollow, thin-walled bones reduce weight without sacrificing strength, and the fusion of certain bones, the pygostyle tail, the carpometacarpus in the wing, created rigid yet lightweight structures ideal for flight. But the skeleton is not just about flight. A lightweight body enables climbing, perching, courting with acrobatic displays, and eventually, the evolution of the most advanced vocal apparatus in the animal kingdom, the syrinx. The syrinx, a sound-producing organ at the base of the trachea, is unique to birds and allows them to produce complex songs, from the mimicry of lyrebirds to the musical phrases of nightingales. This vocal complexity, in turn, enabled sophisticated social communication, territory defense, and mate attraction, driving further speciation. Now, combine these 3 inherited features with small body size and a fast reproductive rate, and you have a formula for explosive adaptive radiation. The emptied world after the KPG boundary was an Eden of opportunity. There were no pterosaurs in the sky, no ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, or mosasaurs in the seas, no large terrestrial herbivores to mow down the new growth. Birds immediately filled roles that their dinosaurian cousins had vacated. But here is the kicker. They also invented entirely new roles that no dinosaur had ever occupied. Think about nectar feeding. The first hummingbirds appeared in the Eocene, evolving the ability to hover, to sip nectar from flowers, and in doing so, they co-evolved with flowering plants in a dance that had no Mesozoic precedent. Think about penguins, which took the avian body plan and turned it into a torpedo for chasing fish in freezing southern oceans, developing dense bones for ballast and flipper-like wings that no theropod had ever approximated. Think about the soaring albatross, with a wingspan exceeding 3 meters, reading the wind over the open ocean for weeks. Think about the woodpecker, with shock-absorbing skull bones and a chisel-like beak, exploiting a niche that required a complete re-engineering of the head. The post-asteroid bird radiation didn't just replace what was lost, it expanded the boundaries of vertebrate possibility. But how exactly did so much diversity emerge from so few survivors? The genetic evidence points to a fascinating pattern. The ancestors of the 4 surviving lineages likely lived in different parts of the world. The paleognaths, ostriches and kin, in the southern continents, the waterfowl globally, the landfowl in the northern continents, and the neo-avian ancestor somewhere, still debated. Once the extinction crisis passed, these 4 stocks radiated outward, meeting and sometimes competing, but more often partitioning the ecological space. The songbirds, or oscines, are the most dramatic example. Today, they account for nearly half of all bird species. They originated in Australia and spread throughout the world in a series of waves, each wave coinciding with new ecological opportunities, the expansion of grasslands, the development of seasonal forests, the evolution of fruit-bearing plants. The songbird brain, with its specialized song-learning nuclei, allowed cultural transmission of song, which in turn accelerated speciation. A new song could quickly create reproductive isolation, splitting one population into 2 species in mere thousands of years. But wait, it gets even bigger. The genetic toolkits of birds are streamlined. Birds have smaller genomes than most amniotes, with fewer repetitive elements and a tighter organization of genes. This compactness might facilitate faster evolutionary change because regulatory elements are closer to the genes they control. Studies show that birds have lost thousands of genes over the course of their evolution, shedding genetic baggage that perhaps constrained their dinosaurian ancestors. The loss of teeth, for instance, is not just a matter of a few missing genes. It involved the entire network of enamel and dentin production, freeing up developmental resources that could then be redeployed elsewhere, perhaps in beak shape variation or in the immune system. Beaks are now the most varied vertebrate feeding structures, from the hooked tearing bill of an eagle to the delicate probing bill of a curlew, from the filter feeding bill of a flamingo to the seed-crushing beak of a hawfinch. All this from a toothless predecessor that scraped seeds from the post-apocalyptic soil. The post-asteroid bird radiation also saw the repeated loss of flight. Retites, ostriches, emus, cassowaries, rheas, kiwis are all flightless, and they descend from flying ancestors that independently lost the ability, likely because the absence of terrestrial predators and the abundance of ground-level resources made flight unnecessary. But the retites are not a single group that lost flight once. Molecular phylogenies suggest that flightlessness evolved multiple times, and that the retites are paraphyletic, meaning that ostriches, for example, may have lost flight separately from emus. This repeated loss is a testament to how costly flight is and how readily birds can reallocate their energy budgets when the selective pressure eases. Gigantism followed. The moas of New Zealand, the elephant birds of Madagascar, and the terror birds of South America predatory flightless birds that stood over 3 meters tall and filled the role of apex predators for millions of years after the dinosaurs were gone. The terror birds, Phorus racids, were the culmination of the bird lineage's long-suppressed potential. Fast, bipedal, sharp-beaked hunters that would have rivaled any velociraptor. They were the dinosaur form, remade in feather and beak, ruling the plains of South America until the arrival of mammalian competitors. Now consider the oceans. Penguins we've mentioned, but there were also pletopterids, giant, flightless diving birds of the North Pacific that looked like penguins but were actually more closely related to cormorants. And there were the pelegornithids, the bony-toothed birds, which evolved pseudo-teeth on their beaks and soared over the oceans with wingspans of up to 6 meters, the largest flying birds ever. They filled the gap left by the pterosaurs, and they did it with a body plan that was entirely avian, yet superficially convergent with the ancient winged reptiles. But here is the most profound shift. The non-avian dinosaurs had dominated terrestrial ecosystems for over 160 million years. Yet they never produced anything like a songbird, a hummingbird, or a parrot. Their brains, while larger than those of many reptiles, never developed the forebrain expansion that allows birds to solve complex problems, recognize themselves in mirrors, use tools, and learn vocalizations. The bird brain, built on a different architecture from the mammalian brain, evolved a hyperdense packing of neurons that gives some corvids and parrots cognitive abilities exceeding those of dogs and even non-human primates. A New Caledonian crow can craft a hook tool, a sequence of behaviors that requires planning. An African gray parrot can label objects with spoken words and understand abstract concepts like color and number. These cognitive powers emerged from the same basic brain plan that was present in the Jurassic theropods. The asteroid did not grant intelligence. It just removed the competition, allowing the avian lineage to explore cognitive niches that had been precluded by the dominance of larger, more conservative dinosaurian cousins. But here is the twist that brings it all together. As we trace the post-KPG radiation, we find that the rate of morphological evolution in birds was actually highest not immediately after the impact, but during the Eocene, tens of millions of years later, when global temperatures were warm and forest cover was extensive. This suggests that birds were not merely taking advantage of empty niches, they were actively co-creating ecosystems. The diversification of fruit-eating birds drove the evolution of fruiting plants. The nectar feeders drove the evolution of tubular flowers. The seed eaters shaped the evolution of grasses and grains. Birds became keystone players in a cascading web of coevolution that built the modern biosphere. The great evolutionary success of birds was not a passive filling of a vacant lot. It was a creative, world-changing force. Now, sit with this. Birds are not just the survivors of the dinosaur extinction. They are the dinosaurs that never stopped evolving. The asteroid did not end the age of dinosaurs, it just pruned one branch, the bird branch. And that branch, released from the shadow of its larger cousins, has now become the most visible, vocal, and species-rich tetrapod lineage on Earth, with over 10,000 species compared to about 6,000 mammals. Every sparrow, every penguin, every eagle is a living dinosaur, its body plan directly inherited from the Jurassic. When you hear a robin sing at dawn, you are hearing the voice of a theropod. When you watch a hummingbird hover, you are seeing the finest aerial engineering that theropod evolution has ever produced. The age of dinosaurs is still ongoing, it just wears feathers. But the story has a dark underbelly. The very traits that made birds so resilient and so explosively diverse are now facing a new test, one that is unfolding at a pace that dwarfs even the KPG extinction. And this time, the threat didn't come from space. It came from the last surviving dinosaurs themselves. The secret that allowed birds to outlast Tyrannosaurus might not be enough to save them from the modern world we've built. because the same evolutionary agility that let them crack seeds in the impact winter is now turning against them in the face of habitat loss, climate change, and a rate of extinction that exceeds even the worst days of the Paleogene. The survivors of the asteroid are now the silent witnesses to a new catastrophe, and the question is no longer how they endured the fire, but whether they can survive us. The survivors of the asteroid are now the silent witnesses to a new catastrophe, and the question is no longer how they endured the fire, but whether they can survive us. Let that sink in. The same lineage that weathered the worst day in Earth's history, that saw the global forests burn and the sun go out, is now facing an extinction rate that rivals, and in some ways exceeds, the KPG boundary. And this time, the asteroid is us. The numbers are staggering. A study published in Science in 2019 by Kenneth Rosenberg and colleagues analyzed decades of bird population data across North America. The result, since 1970, the continent has lost nearly 3 billion birds. Not 3 million, 3 billion. That's a net loss of almost 30% of the total breeding bird population. Common species we take for granted, sparrows, warblers, blackbirds, finches, are vanishing from the landscape with terrifying speed. Grassland birds have been hit hardest, their populations down by more than 50%. Shorebirds are in freefall. Even once ubiquitous species like the red-winged blackbird have declined by tens of millions. This is not a future projection. It's already happened in the span of a single human lifetime. What makes this crisis uniquely dangerous for birds is that it targets the very traits that allowed them to survive the Cretaceous apocalypse. Birds survived the asteroid in part because they were small, fast-breeding generalists that could adapt to a changing world. But now the world is changing faster than any biological adaptation can keep pace. The impact winter lasted perhaps a decade. The current warming trend is accelerating over a century, and the rate of atmospheric carbon dioxide increase is unprecedented in the entire Cenozoic. A bird that could switch from insects to seeds in a pinch cannot suddenly evolve to digest plastic or find insects that no longer exist. The flexibility that saved them is now being stretched beyond its breaking point. Migration, one of the most spectacular avian innovations, is becoming a death trap. Millions of birds undertake hemispheric journeys timed precisely to the emergence of insects and the blooming of plants. But climate change is breaking those ancient schedules. Caterpillars now hatch weeks earlier than they did a century ago, before the migrants arrive to feed them. Warblers starving in a green forest, shorebirds arriving at their Arctic breeding grounds to find the snow melted too soon. The insect peak already passed. They cannot adapt their timing fast enough. The signal that triggers migration is day length, not temperature, and day length hasn't changed. So they arrive too late, year after year, and their chicks starve. Then there's habitat loss, the single greatest driver of bird declines. The forests that sustained the post-asteroid avian radiation, the tropical rainforests, the temperate woodlands, the mangroves and grasslands, are being cleared at a rate of millions of hectares per year. For agriculture, for timber, for urban sprawl. An enantiornithine that lost its forest to the impact winter had no choice but to die. A modern forest specialist like the ivory-billed woodpecker, the kakapo, the Philippine eagle, they face the same fate. The difference is that this time, the forests aren't coming back. When a tropical forest is cut and burned for cattle pasture, the soil is depleted within a few years, and the complex ecosystem that supported hundreds of bird species may never recover in human timeframes. Island birds are the canaries in this coal mine, and they're singing their last songs. Islands are where bird evolution has produced its most extraordinary forms: the flightless rails, the giant moas, the honey creepers of Hawaii, the vangas of Madagascar, the finches of the Galapagos. But islands are also where extinction hits hardest. The arrival of humans, with dogs, rats, cats, pigs, and mongooses, has been catastrophic for island birds that evolved in the absence of terrestrial predators. Since human expansion began, well over 150 bird species have gone extinct, the vast majority of them island endemics. The dodo is the iconic victim, but it was just one of many. The moa of New Zealand, the elephant bird of Madagascar, the great auk of the North Atlantic, all gone. And the wave continues. Today, the critically endangered species list is dominated by island birds, from the weird, nocturnal, parrot-like kakapo of New Zealand to the tiny Maui parrotbill of Hawaii. Their evolutionary specializations, honed over millions of years in isolation, have become liabilities overnight. But wait, it gets even more insidious. The very genetic traits that allowed birds to radiate so explosively after the KPG may now be working against them. Birds have compact genomes, fewer redundant regulatory elements, and a high rate of speciation driven by sexual selection and song learning. This makes them evolutionarily agile, but it also makes them prone to rapid extinction when their specific habitats or mate recognition signals are disrupted. A songbird population isolated by a road or a fragment of forest can quickly diverge in song, leading to reproductive isolation and loss of genetic diversity. That fragmentation, combined with overall population declines, creates extinction vortices, where small populations suffer from inbreeding, loss of adaptive potential, and random demographic accidents. The very thing that produced 10,000 species, the rapid, flexible genome, can also produce local extirpations at an alarming rate. And yet, some birds are thriving in the Anthropocene. This is the paradox that reveals the true nature of survival. Pigeons, house sparrows, European starlings, and crows have not only tolerated human presence, they have exploited it. They eat our garbage, nest on our buildings, and use our waste heat to survive winters. Their populations number in the hundreds of millions. But this success is not a sign that birds are adapting to our world. It's a sign that a very narrow subset of supergeneralists can. The survivors of the current extinction pulse, like the survivors of the KPG, will be those that can live on seeds, garbage, and human detritus, those that breed fast and tolerate disturbance. The specialists, the warblers, the honeycreepers, the albatrosses, the rainforest understory antbirds, may be the enantiornithines of our age. They are exquisitely adapted to a world that is disappearing. This leads to a disturbing parallel. When paleontologists look at the KPG boundary, they see a pattern. The extinction was highly selective. The most abundant and diverse bird group, the enantiornithines, was wiped out. The survivors were a few generalist ground dwellers and water birds. Now, as we look at the modern extinction crisis, we see a similar pattern emerging. The birds declining fastest are the long-distance migrants, the tropical forest specialists, the island endemics, the grassland obligates. The birds holding steady or increasing are the generalists, the urban adapters, the species that have already cozied up to human infrastructure. If current trends continue, the future of birds will be a much less diverse, much less colorful world. A world of crows, pigeons, and sparrows. The new duck ancestors and proto-ostriches. The lineages from which a future radiation might spring, if given the chance and the time. But here is the crucial difference. The asteroid was a singular event, followed by a steady recovery that took millions of years. The current crisis is ongoing and accelerating. It is not a single impact, it is the continuous grinding pressure of habitat destruction, pollution, overexploitation, invasive species, and climate change. And this time, the survivors don't have millions of years to radiate into the emptied niches because we are occupying those niches. The spaces that would be open for a new avian radiation are paved, plowed, or fenced. The evolutionary future of birds is being foreclosed not by a single catastrophe, but by a permanent transformation of the planet's surface. Now, the final surprising detail that reframes the entire story. It's about the chickens. The domesticated chicken, Gallus domesticus, descends from the red jungle fowl of Southeast Asia, a bird that was scratching in the leaf litter of Asian forests, while the last mammoths roamed. Today, the global chicken population is estimated at over 30 billion individuals. That's more than the total number of all wild bird species combined. Chickens are now the most numerous bird on Earth, and arguably the most successful vertebrate species by biomass aside from humans and our livestock. They are the direct living legacy of that KPG survivor, the galliform lineage that included the quail-like survivors of the impact winter. Through an accident of domestication, one of those ancient survivor lineages has achieved a population and geographic spread that no wild dinosaur ever matched. The asteroid-surviving fowl has, in a sense, colonized the world again through human agency. And chickens are not just passive livestock. They carry within their genes the echo of the theropods. Recent developmental biology experiments have reactivated ancestral traits in chicken embryos, growing a snout with teeth, elongating the tail, reverting the beak into the toothed, reptilian jaw of their Jurassic ancestors. The dinosaur is still in there, latent. The genetic toolkit from 165 million years ago is still functional enough that with a few tweaks, a chicken embryo can be made to resemble something very like a small theropod dinosaur. This is not a freak show. It's a profound demonstration that the bird body plan is built on a deeply conserved developmental program that was never entirely overwritten. The dinosaur is not gone. It's just suppressed. So what does this mean for the future? It means that the age of dinosaurs is not over. It has never been over. It just changed its strategy. The non-avian dinosaurs died because they could not flee the fires, could not hide from the cold, could not live on seeds and detritus. The avian dinosaurs survived because they were small, flexible, and lucky. They then exploded into every habitat on Earth, becoming the most diverse land vertebrates. And now they face their next great filter. The question of whether birds can survive us is not just about birds. It's about the last living thread of a lineage that ruled the Earth for 165 million years. If we break that thread, we snuff out the final chapter of the dinosaur story. But if we preserve it, if we protect the habitats and slow the warming, the birds will do what they have always done: adapt, diversify, and sing. Because they were already winning before the asteroid, and despite everything, they are still here. The dinosaurs have weathered one apocalypse. Whether they weather the next is entirely up to us. Whether they weather the next is entirely up to us. And that is not a rhetorical flourish. It's the most direct statement we can make about the next chapter of a 165 million year old story. When you strip away the eons and the Latin names, what you are left with is a simple, humbling truth. The survival of the dinosaur lineage has never been a guarantee. It was a fluke, a lottery, a razor's edge escape followed by an explosive second act. And now the creature that inherited that lineage, the robin on your lawn, the chicken in your supermarket, the eagle on the wing, is facing a filter that is in many ways more relentless than the asteroid. The difference is that this time, the asteroid has a conscience. We can decide whether we are the impact that ends it or the moment that bends the curve. The story we've traced tonight is not one of passive victimhood. It's a story of extraordinary agency. Birds are not fragile relics waiting for our mercy. They are the most gifted dispersers, the most tenacious colonizers, the most adaptive vertebrates on the planet outside of ourselves. Remember that, after the KPG boundary, a handful of small ground dwellers bloomed into 10,000 species in a geological instant. That evolutionary engine is still there, still idling in the genomes of every passerine and parrot and penguin. If we give them space, birds will do what they've always done. They will evolve. They will fill the skies with new songs and new forms. But evolution needs two things: time and habitat. We are rapidly taking away both. There is a concept in paleontology called the dead clade walking. It refers to groups that technically survive a mass extinction but never recover. dwindling to insignificance over the next few million years. The enantiornithines were not even that. They were fully extinguished. The ornithorines were the dead clade that walked, but then they ran and flew and radiated. Today, birds as a whole might become a dead clade walking if we continue on our current trajectory. They might persist in the form of a few supergeneralists, but the great symphony of avian life, the hummingbirds, the albatrosses, the hornbills, the tanagers, the lyrebirds, could be reduced to a whisper. But here is the hopeful flip side. The Cretaceous birds didn't know they were being tested. They just lived, and some of them happened to have the right toolkit. We, on the other hand, know exactly what we are doing. We have the fossil record as a warning and the population data as a dashboard. We can choose to be the recovery, not the impact. We can protect the boreal forests that are the nursery for billions of migratory songbirds. We can keep cats indoors, reduce collisions with glass, fund habitat corridors, and demand climate action. The solutions are not mysterious. They are just waiting for collective will. Now, let's bring this down to a scale you can feel. Tomorrow morning, step outside and listen. If you hear a bird, any bird, you are hearing a direct descendant of the survivors of the Chicxulub apocalypse. That voice is the closest thing to a living dinosaur's call that you will ever hear. It's not a recording from a museum. It's a breathing, singing, nesting creature that shares an unbroken chain of DNA with the feathered theropods of the Jurassic. That is not metaphor. That is genealogy. Tyrannosaurus rex is gone, but its cousin is in your garden, and it sings. That perspective shifts something fundamental. It means that the age of dinosaurs is not a closed chapter. It's an ongoing narrative, and you are alive in the middle of it. Every time you put out a bird feeder, you are intervening in the evolutionary trajectory of a lineage that predates flowers. Every time you protect a patch of native vegetation, you are preserving a stage for the next great radiation. This is not just about conservation. It's about stewardship of a biological inheritance that stretches back to the Triassic. And the birds themselves are still surprising us. New species are being discovered every year, often hidden in plain sight by their songs or genetics. In the dense cloud forests of the Andes, in the archipelagos of Southeast Asia, taxonomists are describing birds that no scientist has ever catalogued. Even in well-studied regions, cryptic species are being split apart by DNA analysis. The total diversity of birds is almost certainly greater than our current count. We are still living in an age of discovery, even as we live in an age of loss. This is the tension that defines our moment. Now, let me leave you with a single image. Imagine a late Cretaceous forest, 66 million years ago. The air is warm and heavy. A small, toothless, feathered creature crouches in the undergrowth, clutching a seed in its beak. High above, a Tyrannosaurus rex lets out a guttural bellow that shakes the ferns. The small creature does not know that the sky is about to catch fire. It cannot conceive of the coming winter. It is just living, surviving, doing what its ancestors have done for 100 million years. That creature is your ancestor, not a distant cousin, a direct, lineal ancestor of every bird you have ever seen. And because of its improbable, stubborn survival, the world after the dinosaurs became a world of birds. Now, you are the one standing in the forest, and the fire this time is of our own making. The question is not whether birds can survive. The question is whether we will be the obstacle or the ally. Because birds were already winning before the asteroid, and if we let them, they will be winning again long after we are gone. But I would rather they win with us. If this journey through deep time and into the present has stirred something in you, then let it stir action. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories that reveal the hidden connections between the past and the present. Drop a comment below with the name of the bird you see most often. where you live. I want to know which dinosaur cousin is visiting your world. Share this video with someone who still thinks birds appeared after the dinosaurs. And if you want to dive deeper, check out the links to the studies and resources we've mentioned in the description. The science is open and it's waiting for you. The dinosaurs never really left us. They just learned to fly. Now it's our turn to make sure the sky never falls silent.